Blessings in Jesus, dear friends. My name is James Jacob Prasch from Oriel Ministries, coming to you here on RTN Christian TV and radio. Here at RTN, we always point out that we are here for the Lord. We are here to reach the unsaved with the gospel, and we are here for you. The Lord has entrusted us with a mandate, and in exercising that calling, we have a variety of features that we put to his kingdom service. In addition to internet, TV, and radio, we also have uh, some very edifying Christian worship music in the worship ministry. We have podcasts, we have social media, and we have a range of Christian authors, speakers, evangelists, Bible expositors, and so forth. Please avail yourself of the ministry of RTN, and please tell other believers about it. We are committed to solid doctrine, but we are also committed to maintaining an independence that we cannot be audited or edited by the powers that be who may disagree with some of our views concerning our stance on moral issues or issues that the Word of God pronounces to be moral that are at odds with popular culture today. And we keep our own servers, we keep our own independence, even though we are available on YouTube, we're available on a range of other platforms. So here we are at Word for the Weekend. The world is caught up in the aftermath of political changes, in part triggered by the election of Donald Trump. We are not here to politically editorialize or to seek to identify the gospel of Jesus with any political party or even ideology. But what we are here to do is to examine world events through the scope of Scripture, to look at developing world events in light of biblical prophecy. We have no doubt that so much of what is transpiring in today's world is historically unique and are events that were foretold both in the New Testament by the apostles and, of course, by Jesus himself, and in the Old Testament by the Hebrew prophets. None more prolifically and more focally than Daniel. Turn with me to the Hebrew prophet Daniel, please, chapter 2. Now, Daniel is a unique book in several different categories of variation. One of which is, it is the only book of the Bible that contains all three biblical languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. It even has some Greek words for things like musical instruments. However, the sections of Daniel, which deal primarily with Israel and the Jews, are in Hebrew. The sections of Daniel that deal with Israel in relation to other nations, the Gentile nations, are in Aramaic, which was the lingua franca of the time. And then we have some Greek words. Chapter 2. Look with me, please. Daniel chapter 2 will begin at verse 20. Daniel answered and said, "Let the name of God be blessed forever and ever, for wisdom and power belong to him." We must remember the world has a false wisdom, and the world has a false sense of power that can fail. God's power ultimately will always triumph, and his wisdom is irrefutable and incomprehensible. It continues in verse 21. It is he who changes the times and the epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings. Now, as we have highlighted or pointed out, at least from time to time, something unique is going to happen at the close of the age, possibly in our lifetime. For the second half of the final 7 lunar years of history, spoken of in Daniel chapter 9, for 3.5 years, 2 times time and a half time, 42 months, 1,260 to 1,290 days, the lordship of history that God has always exercised will temporarily and within certain parameters be given over to Satan. Jesus having 3.5 years of public ministry, Satan will demand the same for Antichrist, and within certain parameters, he will get it. God will say this far, no further, this long, no longer, but he will have his 3.5 years. The lordship of history will be given over to Satan. This takes place during the final 7 years of history, and it'll be particularly the second half of the final 7 years. But when Satan begins to exercise that kind of power, the Lord's wrath is poured out. A difference between his wrath and tribulation. Tribulation comes from the devil. Wrath comes from God. Believers, saved Christians, are told we are not appointed unto wrath. Now, we also have to recall there are sections of Daniel that apply to the church and to Gentile nations, but there are sections that are Judeo-exclusive, that are focused on Israel and the Jews and have a special meaning for Jewish believers who will come to faith at the very close of the age. I only point these things out in passing by way of background. But he changes the times and epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings. We've talked about this before. All political and civil and legal power comes from God. He allows it. Even wicked rulers can only be there by the hand of God. We have to understand something. Had it not been for the reign of terror of Sovietism unleashed by Joseph Stalin following the death of Vladimir Lenin, the Jewish Zionists who were disappointed by Bolshevism would not have come to Israel, irrigated the desert and drained the swamps, trying to make a Jewish model of collectivism, socialism, as it were, even a benevolent communism that would be genuinely egalitarian and give people a high standard of living. They would not have been prompted to do that had Stalin not come to power and did what he did. The kibbutz movement and the Moshav movement that built the infrastructure of the modern state of Israel during the beginning during the Aliyah, but gaining fast momentum in the early days of the Jewish nation in the late 1940s and into the 50s, would not have happened had it not been for Stalin. It's declined now to a great degree, and it's been redefined and reorganized as an economic model, but to date, it is the only form of communism that has ever worked in giving a high standard of living, a high standard of democracy, and creating a genuinely egalitarian society. One of the reasons the Soviet Union wouldn't let the Jews immigrate to Israel, one of the reasons they began backing the Islamic nations against Israel, was because the Zionistic model of socialism, which again is now obsolete and largely much of it is gone. It no longer predominates in the Israeli economy. But it was a form of socialism that actually worked, in contrast to the Soviet Union and other communist countries where it failed and failed miserably. But had it not been for Stalin and all of his treachery that we read about in books like The Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, had it not been for Stalin, Israel would not be a nation. The Zionist movement never would have gained momentum. Similarly, had it not been for the Holocaust, for Adolf Hitler, there never would have been the international sentiment for the United Nations to vote for partition and allow for the restoration of the Jews to their ancient land. The British reneged the Bellflower Declaration. They first agreed to it, but then abandoned it for political reasons. Then most Jews, particularly American Jewry, which was the seat of world Jewry after the Holocaust, most of the Jews in continental Europe were killed. 2/3 were killed of European Jewry. American Jewry did not see Zionism as a realistic ideal. They called the Reformed Jews called their synagogues temples, meaning they don't believe a temple is ever going to have to exist in Jerusalem again. The promised land is Long Island and California. That was their thinking. Had it not been for the Holocaust, the UN never would have voted for partition and reestablished Israel as a nation in their native land, and global Jewry, or what was left of it after the Holocaust, never would have supported Zionism the way it did, seeing the need for a homeland as some kind of a guarantee of Jewish survival. Well, these are the realities. God even allowed Hitler and Stalin to come to power for his purposes and to achieve his prophetic agenda, much of which is outlined in the book of Daniel. We continue. He gives wisdom, that is, the Lord gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding. Okay, so it is the Lord who establishes kings and removes kings. When we see political changes, even adverse ones, we have to see the hand of God. He's allowing it for some particular reason. This has always been the case. He's allowed it for some particular reason. It was a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph, who began persecuting the Jews in Egypt. They never would have returned to their land and received the Torah had God not allowed a Pharaoh to come to power who was an anti-Semite and who was wicked. God allowed it. We can talk about Haman in the book of Esther and other wicked people. God always allows it for a reason, even political adversity, even despotic governments, even dictators, even anti-Semites, and even persecutors of the church. God always allows it for a reason, even if it is someone and something bad. God ultimately will work all things together for the better to those who love him and are called according to his purpose in Romans 8. That concerns the church. In Romans 8, all things are not for the better, but work together for the better for born-again believers, truly saved Christians who follow Christ. Concerning Israel, even in their unbelief, God will regather them and reveal Christ to them at the close of the age. And we know, as the Hebrew scriptures say, Hine lo yanum velo yishan shomer Israel. He who keepeth Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps. God always has a purpose in allowing history to unfold the way it does. And this includes who he allows to assume royal political power and whom he removes from it. Right now, for the second time since Donald Trump's first election and since Brexit, Judeo-Christian values, as defined biblically, not by popular definition of Judeo-Christian value, but by biblical definition, have received a reprieve. Donald Trump was supportive of evangelical concerns in the moral realm, in the moral sphere. He was someone who spoke up more than any other president against the persecution of Christians in various countries. And he was somebody who defended and supported Israel, in contrast to presidents who've been anti-Israel of both parties. The Bush family pandered to the Saudi Arabians at the expense of Israel very often. Certainly Barack Obama and Joseph Biden were enemies of Israel who grudgingly had to placate the Jewish vote in America and feign support for Israel when in fact their actions said the opposite. His closing gesture before he left the White House, Barack Obama lobbied other members of the United Nations, such as New Zealand and Great Britain, to vote against Israel in the UNESCO vote, saying that the Israelites, the Jews, the Hebrews, had no claim to any biblical sites as Jewish sites in terms of their religious and historical importance to the Jewish people. You don't have an inherent right to the Wailing Wall or any of these things. That was Obama. He was an enemy of Israel, and he was an enemy of the Jewish people. He was an enemy of the Christian church. He lit the White House up in the colors of the homosexual flag after lying and saying that he believed marriage was heterosexual. He changed his tune when the Supreme Court forcibly imposed homosexual marriage. What did Barack Obama do? Celebrate it, lighting up the rainbow flag on the White House. He was an adversary of the body of Christ, an adversary of God, adversary of Israel. But he had political power. Well, now there's another respite. Donald Trump has been elected again, and that is God's hand. As I've pointed out on previous webcasts here on Word for the Weekend and elsewhere, I do not believe Donald Trump is a saved Christian. I see him the way the Israelis see him, someone in the character of Darius the Mede or Cyrus the Great, a benevolent Gentile leader who God uses for his purpose. He's not pro-life, but he's more pro-life than the pro-death candidates he ran against, who wanted to be able to abort a baby right up to 40 weeks gestation. He is by no means opposed to homosexuality, but he is opposed to forcing the same-sex agenda. He is more in tune with the moral values of the Judeo-Christian faith. That is true. It's a time of respite. It's a time of respite. At a time of growing anti-Semitism, God has allowed him to come to power. We see the hateful anti-Israel policies of other English-speaking democracies, the government of Australia, the government of New Zealand, the government of the Republic of Ireland, the government of Starmer in Great Britain, the government of Trudeau, all pandering to militant Islam, ignoring the civil rights abuses that take place in the Muslim world and the plight of Christians in those countries and the realities of Islamic terror. They just placate it, ignore it, accuse people of homophobia for protesting and saying so. The British police knocking on people's doors, arresting people for what they post on the internet, even though the statements are true. You've got a British activist who was charged with civil violations of civil law, imprisoned as a criminal, being adjudicated as a criminal for what was alleged to be a civil offense. The Tommy Robinson thing. This attack on democracy. And it came to the United States with Silicon Valley. The FBI putting Christian parents on terrorist watch lists because they didn't want their children indoctrinated into the same-sex agenda at the age of 5. This is just wickedness. Yet there is now something of a respite. God has allowed this respite. We talked about this on our previous Word for the Weekend. We must make the most of it evangelistically, and it is urgent that we pray for the administration of Mr. Trump. But this has kicked off a series of political changes that we'll be looking at, some of them in light of what is further written here in Daniel chapter 2. Immediately, anything that happens in Great Britain affects America. Anything that happens in America affects Great Britain. The distance across the Atlantic is closer than the distance culturally, politically, and economically than the distance from Britain to continental Europe. If something happens in the States, it affects Canada. It happens in Canada, it affects the States. There's no getting away from this. What happens in the States and Britain inevitably affects Australia. Inevitably. The Five Eyes, as they're known. The 5 main English-speaking democracies, so-called, even though I no longer believe that Britain is truly democratic. I certainly don't believe that Canada is truly democratic under Trudeau, and I don't believe that Australia under Albanese is any more a genuinely democratic country. America may be the last outpost, and their democracy is under attack. Attacking the First Amendment, attacking the Second Amendment, attacking free speech. calling something hate speech, which simply means speech they hate. You don't agree with them, you don't toe the party line. It's like the Soviet Union with Pravda and its Vestia, um, and TASS, the Soviet news agency. Truth is defined politically, not by reality. You say something that the elitists didn't like, that's hate speech, or that's anti-Soviet, it's unpatriotic, it has to be stopped, it's criminal. Well, that's what they tried to do or trying to do in Britain, and they're doing it. Certainly in Canada, they're doing it. And they've attempted it in America, the FBI going to Silicon Valley. There's a respite. Now you see Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, and Zuckerberg from Facebook and so forth coming to pay homage to Trump at Mar-a-Lago. God has given him the cards for the time being. We must keep him in prayer. He is not a Christian. And when he was last in office, he received some advice from some very sinister false brethren, some false teachers and false prophets and prophetesses. He listened to people he should not have, claiming to be believers. The Paula White type people who were heretics, who were false brethren. He listened to them, and he shouldn't have. And they'll be all over the White House again, trying to influence him. But we have a period of respite, and he needs prayer. Okay, may the Lord give him wisdom. I'm not comfortable with his administration. Cyrus Vance came from the American, not Cyrus Vance, Vice President Vance. Cyrus Vance is an ultra-liberal Democrat. But President Vance, Vice President Vance, who may be the next president, came from a Bible Belt area of the United States and converted to Roman Catholicism. So many of the people are from a Roman Catholic background. That includes Robert Kennedy Jr., obviously, Irish Catholic. That includes Marco Rubio. He's going to be the Secretary of State, the Foreign Minister of the United States, as a Catholic. Mr. Holman, in charge of border security, the Roman Catholic. He's surrounded by many Roman Catholics. Now, many Roman Catholics do not allow the Vatican or the Roman Church to influence them politically. It is something that we've seen repeatedly. You had Democrat politicians like Pelosi or Roman Catholic who were pro-abortion going against the position of the Roman Church. Biden himself didn't care about it. JFK supported the banning of prayer in the schools by the Supreme Court. They're a Warren decision. Roman Catholics will not necessarily take their instructions from the Pope, particularly not in the United States. But they're not believers. They need to become believers. Here's the problem. No, he's not a brother in Christ and all these kind of things like these naive Christians think. But God did put him there, and his election constitutes a reprieve, both for the true church and for Israel. Now, look what's happened since. As we speak, Trudeau is in big trouble in Canada. There is a backbench revolt in the Canadian Parliament in Ottawa. There are premiers of provinces of Canada calling for him to resign, even from his own party. A terrible woman, a terrible, terrible woman, who was the finance minister of Canada and who was a deputy prime minister. His deputy, Chrysler Freeland, resigned the day before yesterday, creating a crisis within his party. Now, she's a terrible woman. When they arrested peacefully protesting lorry drivers and truck drivers during the COVID pandemic, she was the one who was freezing their bank accounts and hunting down people who were sympathetic to them. She's an enemy of democracy. She's a wicked, wicked woman. Christian pastors were being arrested for holding services in Canada. She was a wicked woman, but she's gone. What we see now in Canada and what we're beginning to see in Britain and what we're seeing in the United States is the left beginning to devour each other. You see this in America. You see Rosie O'Donnell attacking Joe Scarborough, and you see Mayor Bill Maher attacking George Clooney, and they're going after each other. They're going after each other. Well, let them devour each other. They're under God's judgment. God has raised his hand against the left because of their moral bankruptcy, because of their promotion of the LGBTQ agenda, because of their war on Christians, because of their pandering to radical Islam and their anti-Semitism and war on Israel and the Jews, because of certainly non-therapeutic abortion. They're under God's judgment for now. That's not to say they will not eventually reorganize under some kind of demonic influence or empowerment and have a resurgence and seek a day of vengeance. But for now, they are in decline. There's respite. This is what's happening. Okay. There are people in Canada demanding the resignation of Trudeau from his own party as well as the opposition. He's a failed prime minister. They know he has no moral integrity. They know he waged war against Canadian democracy. They know he has been a failure in his handling of the economy and the budget. The deficits and the economic performance of Canada have plummeted under Trudeau. Plummeted. With the United States as a next-door neighbor, and the Americans surviving these things despite the damage done to the economy by Biden and Harris. Despite that, Canada could have automatically almost benefited had it had the right government and right policies, but it didn't. The Canadian people have turned against Trudeau. He could not win an election, so he refuses to hold one, and he's refusing to resign. He's fighting for power, not fighting the opposition. Simply, he's fighting his own party. And similar things are happening in the United States. Well, that's in North America. Let's look at Europe. But first, let's look at Britain. Never in the modern history of the UK has a party come to power in government and seen its support base disintegrate so quickly. Individual prime ministers have seen their support base disintegrate overnight. Liz Truss is an example. Prime ministers have seen their support base disintegrate. But never has a party's support base disintegrated so totally, so quickly. Again, Starmer, a socialist, an enemy of Israel, no friend of Christianity, and he is come under God's judgment now, the same as Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, has come under God's judgment. He's in trouble. He's fighting for his political survival. Obviously, Genesis 12, verse 3 meant nothing to him. Obadiah 15 meant nothing to him. He doesn't care about cursing Israel or the ramifications of it. He doesn't realize the British Empire collapsed the way it did because of the revocation of the Balfour Declaration. He doesn't understand that when Britain blessed Israel with William Wilberforce and the Earl of Shaftesbury and then obviously Benjamin Disraeli, Britannia ruled the waves. And of course, the left in America doesn't understand that God's judgment would have come on America a long time ago had it not been for the fact that 3 out of every $5 spent on missions and evangelism come from the USA. Not all of it good, but 3 out of $5. It's not all well spent. And that America has treated Israel and the Jews better than other countries. If those two things were not true, America would be under God's judgment worse than it already is. But again, we have a respite. We have a respite. Starmer's in trouble. Trudeau's in trouble. Let's see continental Europe, however. In Holland, you have a minority caretaker government. Geert Wilders, he's like the Donald Trump of Holland, also pro-Israel. His wife is Jewish, as is Starmer's wife, ironically. Does not quite have enough seats in the parliament to form a government, but he's on the ascent. This week, Olaf Scholz's government, another left-wing government in Europe, has not survived the no-confidence vote. There will have to be elections in Germany. Now, look what's happened to Germany. Germany was the paymaster of the EU. Although Germany lost the Second World War strategically, in the aftermath, it won it economically. Much like Japan, it was a loser strategically, but it became a winner economically. That's over for both Japan and for Germany. Germany has recently overtaken Japan as the world's third biggest economy. But Germany's in trouble. Big trouble. A prolonged recession. Japan will never be what it was. Germany will not be what it was. And they tried desperate things to make it happen. One of the things they tried to make it happen was the euro. We need to be like the United States if we're going to be a power. We live in a post-colonial world. There's no longer a British or a French empire or a Belgian empire. There's no longer a Tanganyika or a Namibia, big German colonies in Africa. There's no longer an Angola or a Mozambique, Portuguese colonies in Africa. There's no longer a Congo, as that year, Congo, a Belgian colony in Africa. And these are big colonies, not small. They're countries in themselves. Chad was French. Algeria was French. Well, these things are all gone. Spanish Morocco is no longer Spanish. How can these old colonial powers still pack punch? Well, Britain was able to pack punch because of the Five Eyes, because it was the mother country of the United States. It may be playing second fiddle, but Britain is still a player on the global stage because of its partnership with the United States within the G7. Winston Churchill was half American. Mrs. Thatcher was an Atlanticist. John Major was half American. His father was from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. You've always had this, going back to John Jacob Astor, the Astor family, the Anglo-Americans. Lady Astor was Labor Party, but she was American, from an American family, first woman in British Parliament. Britain has always been able to be a player through the special relationship with the United States. Okay, Britain. But what about the countries of the continent? Not so. What's France going to do? What's Spain going to do? What is Germany going to do? Well, we'll be like the United States. We'll get a common currency. Oh boy. Even post-Brexit, the main language in Brussels, in the Brussels bureaucracy, is English, because it is the language, the lingua franca of this time in history, and the main language of the internet, that the most government leaders and most diplomats and economists can all speak. Not too many diplomats or government leaders in Germany speak Portuguese, but they all speak English. Not too many diplomats or government leaders in Portugal speak German, but they all speak English. But then there's the currency. We'll have a dollar. Now, the euro is not the dollar. They just tried to make it that, but what the euro is the old Deutschmark with the new name. The European Central Bank is not really the Central Bank of Europe in the sense of the American Federal Reserve System. What it is the German Bundesbank with a new name. The weaker countries in Europe that Daniel refers to as the clay. Greece had the drachma, Italy had the lira, Spain had the peso. They could undervalue their own currencies against the Deutschmark to be able to be competitive in the European common market for trade. By getting the euro, which is just, again, a rechristened Deutschmark, now they can't do that anymore. It put Germany on top economically. But now Germany has economically declined to a point that would have been seen as unimaginable 20 years ago. These declines in Germany are major. Then there's France. 1 week ago, thereabout, the German government could not survive a no-confidence vote in the Reichstag in Berlin. 3 weeks ago, the French government could not survive. It collapsed. Now, France has a presidential system where, in terms of foreign relations and defense, the president, Macron, is the executive with concentrated power, but not in the internal affairs or the internal economy of France. That is the prime minister, and he's gone. The government of France has fallen. The government of Germany has fallen. The government of Holland has fallen. The government of Canada on the other side of the Atlantic is falling. They're falling. There are Donald Trumps springing up in Europe and in Britain. The Reform Party of Nigel Farage, the Conservative Party, failed so shamefully and miserably that Labour, although not popular, won the last British election. Boris Johnson, although he supported Brexit, was a big disappointment otherwise, especially in the mishandling of COVID. Sunak, a gross disappointment, a Hindu celebrating Diwali in number 10 Downing Street. Scotland, a Muslim first minister, and the corruption of Sturgeon and the Scottish National Party. Horrible. All of it horrible. What a mess. What a mess. Well, there are people in Britain trying to blame Brexit. The Europhiles in Britain are trying to blame Brexit for the problems in the British economy. This is crazy. This is absolutely crazy. Look at Europe. Look at the economy of France. It's at the precipice. Germany's almost gone over the cliff. But you have a Nigel Farage, a Reform Party. That's the new Conservative Party. Now, fortunately, the people presently running the Conservative Party are more conservative. A very well-spoken young black woman, Kemi Badenoch, and a very well-spoken young Asian woman, Suella Braverman. Now, I have no problem with the fact that you have Black and Asian conservatives. I care about the fact they can do the job. And they can. But the very fact that the Tory party now has non ethnic English, non Anglo Celtic, non whites, non Caucasian leaders, this just shows you what has happened to the traditional Tory party since Margaret Thatcher. It's gone. Thank God that we have Miss Badenoch and we have Miss Braverman, in my own opinion. I wish them well. But I'm particularly grateful to God for Nigel Farage. If the Tories come to power again, they can only do it in a coalition with Nigel Farage. There is a respite on the way in Britain, all being well, if we pray, a respite that will stop pandering to radical Islam, that will stop trying to sell British democracy down the river. A respite. A Gert Wilders in Holland. A very able Miss Mahoney in Italy. Again, she is not part of the left-wing, socialist, elitist, European, Brussels, globalist establishment. And although I had great concerns about her father due to his fascist and anti-Semitic leanings, his daughter, Marie Le Pen, claims not to agree with her father on those points. She is on the automatic ascent because of the collapse of the French government. There are changes taking place in Europe, in Britain, the same as the changes have already taken place in America and are about to take place in Canada. A respite, a change. The EU is in trouble. It is an unelected socialist bureaucracy. The Council of Europe is not a legitimate Senate. It is not a legitimate government. It's unelected, elitist, socialist bureaucrats characterized by misallocation and misappropriation of taxpayer money from all these countries. Brussels has penalized Britain for having the most productive agricultural system and food production in Europe. So therefore, under the common agricultural policy, the British were penalized for being productive in order to reward the less productive economies of continental Europe. Now they're still demanding fishing rights to come in and take the fish from Britain and Ireland. And Ireland is another problem. This week, Israel closed its embassy in Ireland due to the left-wing, increasingly anti-Semitic, increasingly Islam pandering parties of the Republic of Ireland. Even though there are many people in Ireland who disagree with it. There are populists in Ireland who are sick of Sinn Féin, of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael and the Irish Labour Party. They're tired of what radical Islam is doing in Ireland. People in Finland are being fed up, and in Denmark with what radical Islam are doing in Scandinavia. There is a reaction in Germany and in France. Will there be a respite? Anti-Semitism has reached the pitch not seen since the Holocaust. There is a conflict. We have to remember when we read Daniel, we see on back of these things, there are spiritual forces at work, principalities. Let's continue and resume Daniel chapter 2, verse 31. He sees the statue made of fine gold, its breasts and its arms of silver. Head is the gold, wealth. That is the mind of the world. Arms of silver. Silver always has to do in the Bible. It's a tarnishing metal. Where gold will not oxidize, silver will. It's powerful, but not of the same value as gold. And there's two arms. Now, this, of course, in part goes back to the Babylonian and Persian empires, the Media and Persian. But then it continues. Its stomach and its thighs of bronze, nechoshet in Hebrew, and its legs of iron, its feet partially of iron and partially of clay. You continued looking until the stone was cut without hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and crushed them. Then the iron and the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all crushed at the same time and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors, and wind carried them away, so that not a trace of them was found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain, and it filled the whole earth. It goes on from Media and Persia to Greece. Okay. Babylon, Media, Persia, then Greece, all the way down to the pelvis. The reproductive organs are in the pelvic region of human anatomy on this statue. Greece had the seminal influence, Hellenism, of the Western world. The Roman Empire came from Greece in its culture and in its philosophies, and even its superstitions and religions. Greece had the seminal influence. Then you have the iron. Two legs. You have the Greek-speaking east of the Roman Empire and the Latin-speaking west. Ultimately, Constantine the Great, trying to stop the fragmentation, moved his capital east from Rome to Istanbul, to Constantinople. We know these things, but I digress. You've got the iron and the clay. We read the following about this fourth beast in verse 40. These sections of the statue that correspond in part to the beasts. When you see these four beasts later in Daniel, they exist simultaneously. They're a composite, but they also correspond to the four sections of the statue. So these later beasts that you see in Daniel, they have a correspondence to the four sections of the statue of Nebuchadnezzar. But it had the wings of the eagle and it had the bear and the lion. They existed simultaneously. Ultimately, the kingdom of Antichrist will be a monster, and it will be eclectic. It'll have features of all of these global powers. It'll incorporate features of these global powers in the kingdom of Antichrist. But we see the fourth one. Great and terrible. It breaks everything else. The Celts were able to stop the expansion of the Roman Empire. It is not that the Romans could not have defeated the Picts and Scots if they wanted to, or the Irish or the Welsh or the Cornish. It's just that they would have sustained such high casualties in doing it, it wasn't worth it. They considered the Irish to be the Hibernians, they call them, and they said all of their songs are sad and their wars are happy. It's no point in fighting with them for this relatively small island. The Picts and Scots fought notoriously. Rome, if it was determined to, could have invaded Scotland, but they would have had so many casualties that would have weakened the overall empire. Just wouldn't have been worth it. The Romans invaded Wales. They reached Anglesey, but they never conquered all Wales. They never conquered Cornwall. They left the Celts alone. The Celts were notorious fighters. Even though they might have been able to conquer them if they were determined to, the cost would have been too high. It wouldn't have been worth it. They themselves would have been vulnerable to other potential enemies, particularly the Persians. The Romans were at peace with another major empire, a regional empire, but it was major in its area, the Armenian Empire, which accepted Christianity before Rome did. But the big threat was Persia. In the time of Jesus, Phrygia. Phrygia. They withstood Rome for 300 years, even though they were conquered by Alexander the Great. They reasserted and kept their own power. Rome was strong enough to stop them. But if Rome invaded and tried to conquer them the way Alexander the Great did, even if they won, even if they were victorious, the Persians would have inflicted such a tremendous amount of damage and casualties on the Roman legions, it wouldn't have been worth it. It was better to have a cold war. There was a cold war between Rome and Persia in the time of Jesus. So, Rome is trying to hold together the pottery with the metal, the iron and the clay, but they don't adhere to each other. We've explained before, the reason you see the ecumenical agenda being pushed in league with the Vatican in Europe so much, and the idea of reversing the Reformation, is because a Slavic person from Poland, a Celtic person from Ireland, a Latin person from Portugal, and a Germanic person from Austria. They're anthropologically very different. They don't have a common history. They don't have a common language. They don't have a common culture. They don't have a common cuisine. The only thing they have in common is Roman Catholicism. It becomes a way, a glue, to help make iron stick to the clay. Poorer countries, like in Eastern Europe, Poland being a very Catholic country, Ireland being a very Catholic country, holding on to a reconfederated Roman Empire, and they're using religion as one of the ways to do it. But there are other ways they tried to do it. We are told the following, verse 43, the iron mixed with common clay, they will combine with one another in the seed of men. Although iron does not adhere to clay, one is going to be tough and one is going to be soft. Those countries that came out of the Soviet Union's control in the aftermath of the Cold War, those countries that came out of the Warsaw Pact, the Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, although it's somewhat growing, Hungary, another one. They have some economic development, but they're nowhere near Germany or Britain or France. They're nowhere near Western Europe or Britain. Some is going to be strong, some is going to be weak. But it's not working now. As long as Germany was the paymaster, and they were building roads around Dublin and highways. There were N roads, national roads in Ireland. I remember when I was in my 30s even. You could drive on these N roads in Ireland, and once you got away from Dublin and Cork, people would be driving sheep on them. The EU comes. Nobody gives you something for nothing, but they put the big billboard, Europe's paying for this and buy Patty a pint, and he'll sign anything. They're all on board with the EU. That's the way they looked at it. Well, where was the EU getting the money? Germany was the paymaster. On one hand, Germany was economically dominating the other countries in Europe, but then it had the cash, and the other countries became reliant on German handouts via Brussels. Now, Germany can't do that anymore in the same way, to the same degree. Brussels is in trouble because Germany is in trouble. Not only that, but the Americans are saying it was the Americans and British who won the Cold War. It was the Americans and British who won World War One. It was the Americans and British who won World War Two. It was the Americans and British who won the Cold War. Why do we always get the bill? In the former Yugoslav, it was the Americans and the British, not the other countries of NATO. Now the Ukraine. Americans are fed up not just fighting other people's wars, as many Americans see it, but paying for the defense. Why should American taxpayers pay more for the defense of European countries than Europeans do? This is one of the things that Donald Trump highlights all the time. Except for Britain, nobody's ever really stood with America to the degree that America has stood with the continent. So now Europe gets hit with having to cough up more money for its own defense. The Americans don't want to pick up the tab anymore. If we're putting in 2.1% of GDP to defend Europe, Europe has to put up 2.1% of GDP to defend Europe. Russia and Ukraine are a lot closer to Europe than they are to Pennsylvania. More economic demands on Europe. Europe is in trouble. Germany, precarious, in decline. Look at it. Governments of Europe falling one after another. Not surviving no confidence votes. The euro has never come close to replacing the dollar and won't. Either will the BRICS, at least not in the short term. The Russian ruble's in trouble. The Indian rupee is not doing that well. Obviously, the yuan, China is in major trouble. I'm in Asia at the moment. The Chinese economy is in far worse shape than it's telling its own people, and far worse shape than it wants the rest of the world to know. How do you make the iron stick to the clay? Americans aren't going to have another Marshall Plan and bail you out again. They've got major deficits of their own. China, it's not going to be the great source of capital investment. If they invest, it's because they want to get control of you for some political reason. Companies like Huawei. And the European governments know it. Not that they'll do anything about it. Globalism is being shaken by populism. Iron does not stick to clay. But in verse 43, they tried to make them combine in the seed of men. We've warned about this before. Multiculturalism. There can be a natural combination of the seed of men. Brazil is like that, where Native Americans, South Americans, Europeans, most Brazilians were the Portuguese descent, the European ones, and Africans, they have a social harmony and a high degree of intermarriage and are producing a homogeneous race over a period of generations, slowly, but it works in Brazil, at least to a degree. That is not working in Europe, and it will not. Jesus told us, nation will rise against nation, ethnon against ethnon. It will be ethnic tension. The Russians and the Ukrainians are both Slavs, but they're enemies. The Poles are Slavs, but they detest Russia. The Baltic states, the Lithuanians, the Estonians, Latvians, they hate Russia because of what Stalin did. It's not working. Iron does not stick to clay, but they will combine by force in the seed of men. They will force multiculturalism. That is why they said if you have a European passport, you can work in any European country. You see people from Eastern Europe working, taking jobs in Western Europe. These countries were basically exporting their unemployment, sending people abroad to get jobs, the way Mexico exports its unemployment to the United States. They combine in the seed of men. But ethnon will rise against ethnon, and basileia against basileia. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. These ethnic divisions will result in political conflicts between nations. The rich and the poor, the iron and the clay, the strong and the weak, the East and the West. Remember, federalism is failing in Britain, the one country in the Western world that was federal is Britain. Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales all have their own parliaments. It is economic factors that are preserving the union of the EU. Oh, I'm sorry, of the UK, of the UK. It's economic interests that are preserving it. If the North Sea oil was not gone, Scotland would have a case to pull out of the United Kingdom. Because of the residual influences of historical Protestantism, Northern Ireland wants to still be in the UK, but that's the reason. But that's the only place. Remember, Anglo-Saxons and Celts never got along. They only forced themselves to unite because of the threat of Roman Catholicism. This took place in Scotland with Bonnie Prince Charles. It took place with Queen Mary in England and so forth. They were forced to unite as Protestants to protect themselves from the power of the Catholic countries of Europe, who were under the political influence of the Pope, who would command these countries to attack Britain. That's what the Spanish Armada was about. That was what the plantations in Ireland were about. That was what the Battle of Culloden was about in Scotland. Okay. So even in the UK, the one federal country, nation in Western Europe, it's not working. But in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, first the Warsaw Pact collapsed, then the Soviet Union collapsed. Then its successor, the CIS, the Confederation of Independent States, collapsed. Now there's fragmentation in Russia. It began with Chechnya. Federalism is collapsing in Eastern Europe, sometimes peaceably, like in the former Czechoslovakia. The Czechs and the Slovaks could get along and could peacefully divide and remain friends. Bratislava and Prague, the Czech Republic, not a problem. Like Slovakia. Well, look what happened in Yugoslavia. Bosnia, Herzegovina, Serbia, an unspeakable bloodbath. And there were no good guys. Everybody had blood on their hands. Kosovo Liberation Army, Islamic, tied to Al Qaeda. Serbs were Tito's communists. The Croatians, they came from the Ustashi Nazis. They were sequestered by Tito. They'd been Nazis. A bloodbath in the former Yugoslavia. The collapse of the Soviet Union, then the CIS. The breakup of the Czech Republic, and smaller examples with Moldova breaking from Romania and things like this. As federalism collapses in Eastern Europe and in Britain, Brussels tries to make federalism, but it doesn't work. It doesn't work for political reasons, economic reasons, cultural reasons, historic reasons, strategic reasons. It doesn't work for anthropological reasons. They're doing everything to make the iron stick to the clay, but it doesn't work. Daniel picks this up, and instead of speaking of an image with four sections, he speaks later of these four beasts in chapter 7. They have a correspondence to those nations, or to those sections of the statue, rather, and ultimately the Antichrist will come from it. The first was like a lion in verse 4, had the wings of an eagle. Okay. It had the feet, 2 feet like a man. A human mind was given to it. And then another beast, the second one, and it was raised up on one side with 3 ribs were in its mouth between its teeth. These things all have political and prophetic symbolism. And I kept looking, and behold, another one like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird, and a beast also 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. Now, ultimately, the Antichrist will get power. He will force this. The way the Pontificus Maximus, the way the Roman emperors did, he will force it for a season. But that's the only way it can work. It's the only way it can work, and it will work only for a season, and it will work diabolically to the detriment of everyone. The power of Satan. Satan will attempt to counterfeit the millennial reign of Christ. I will rule the nations with the rod of iron, says the devil. And as Jesus, as Christ was God who became a man, ultimately Antichrist will be Satan in human form. After his resurrection, he's going to counterfeit the resurrection of Jesus. It'll come to that. But in the meantime, they can use all the glue they want. They can use all the euros they want. They can use the Western European Union and defense cooperations outside of NATO they want. They can try to mix the seeds of men and give work permits for people in Portugal to go work in Denmark, and people in Denmark to go work in Greece, and people in Poland to go work in France. They can do anything like that. But iron does not adhere to clay. Antichrist is not the ultimate end. The Antichrist and false prophet will be the penultimate end. The ultimate end will be something else in Daniel chapter 2. The ultimate end will be what's going to happen. A stone cut without hands. It'll not be something man-made. Will hit this statue on its feet of iron and clay and crush them. And the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, the gold were all crushed at the same time. And that stone that's going to crush it, in verse 35, we are told, that stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled not just Europe or the Middle East, the whole earth. The whole earth will be filled with the glory of the Lord. In Brussels, they have no idea that they're building Satan's kingdom. In Israel, the Orthodox Jews who want to rebuild the temple have no idea that the abomination of desolation is going to be set up in it, and the Antichrist will betray them. They make a covenant with death, Daniel tells us. They have no idea. Beware, the Abraham Accords is a prelude to this. The Antichrist will seek to bring a false peace to the Middle East, attempting to pre-counterfeit Christ. Won't work, but he's going to con people into thinking it will. But he is only the penultimate. These are all man-made things inspired by the devil. There is a true unity, however, a true power, a true establishment of government that will be indestructible and invincible. There will be a true unity that will be indissolvable. And that will be the return of Christ. The iron, the clay, the gold, the silver, the copper, it will all come crashing down. The world empires throughout history foreseen by Nebuchadnezzar and his image, and the way they will ultimately be manifested with the dawn of Antichrist in Daniel 7 and in the book of Revelation. That's what Satan is aiming for. But there's going to be a gambit. People will do these things. God will let them do these things. They will do these things under the inspiration of Satan. But there'll be something different. A stone not cut with human hands. It's going to knock it all down. When Jesus comes, everything will change in a fraction of an instant. Everything. That's what we as believers need to be focused on. We look at these events happening politically, economically, events in Europe, events in the Middle East. We need to be aware of these things and what they mean prophetically. But unlike the people of the world, including their academics and intellectuals, including their governments and economists and captains of industry, we know something they don't. We understand what's on back of globalism. Or perhaps we should say, who is on back of it. We know what it's coming to. And we also know how it will end. That stone not made with human hands will strike it and bring it all down. Then the government will be upon his shoulder. He removes kings and establishes them. He's going to remove these kings. The 7 heads, the 10 horns, the whatever. They'll be removed. And his kingdom will be established. And of his kingdom, there will be no end. Wishing every one of you a blessed Christmas, Hanukkah, and New Year season in Jesus. My name is Jacob Prasch. I'm in Singapore. I'll soon be heading back to the USA. Keep us in prayer.
Hello, and thank you for watching Moriel TV. There are so many things that are happening at Moriel Ministries worldwide, from the Philippines to Japan, to India to Africa, and back to Europe and the United States. So many of our brothers and sisters are spreading the good news of Jesus Christ to this lost world. We are so thankful for your prayers. God has been faithful and has blessed us in so many ways. If you'd like to partner with our efforts abroad and at home, please take a moment to click the link in the description and help us as the Lord leads you. Thank you very much, and God bless.